So now that you've read the Demeter and Persephone myth, we're going to look briefly at the functions of mythology as applied to this particular myth. There are a lot of theoretical perspectives we can use to examine this myth, but we're just going to examine the functions of the myth based on the functions that are on the instructions for the final exam. And again, this will be brief, as we will talk more about these functions here and there throughout the semester. So I'm looking here on the screen at our lecture material on the functions, and you see there's quite a number of them, and you should read this yourself. But let's just run through these so you'll at least have an idea of what each one is supposed to be. So the first function on our list is a teleological. Now, teleological just refers to origins in general, and most of the myths will fall under this larger umbrella of a teleological. So there's a lot of overlap in the myths. Some myths have several functions, and these functions are closely related, but this is still a fairly convenient way to speak about functions. So origins in general could be origins of natural elements. We'll talk about nature function in a moment. Origins of rituals, origins of where the world came from, but just in general, the beginnings. So in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, we read about how Demeter established the Eleusinian mystery cults. She established a new religion. So that would be a particular function of the myth. That's origins, a teleological. Nature functions explain specifically how natural elements came to be, where lightning came from, where a particular volcano or local cave or lake came from, and why it's part of that landscape. So the Demeter and Persephone myth, the most obvious explanation here is that the myth is an explanation of the seasons. When Persephone is below ground, Demeter is unhappy and allows the world to go fallow and nothing grows. When she comes back up to the surface, that is time of rebirth, of spring and renewal. So anything to do with seasons or natural phenomenon in any way or natural landmarks falls under the nature function. The next function is cosmological. And cosmological myths explain where the universe and the world, and sometimes people as well, come from. So we'll look at creation myths, different stories from around the world of how the world came to be. Some cultures explain as far back as the universe. Some cultures presuppose a knowledge of the world and begin their cosmological stories with the creation of people. In the myth of Demeter and Persephone, we do not have any sort of cosmological function. There's no explanation of how the world came to be. So that function does not suit the story. We can look at stories for their psychological function. What kind of messages do they provide for the culture in which they are believed, in terms of how one matures as an individual? So psychological functions can look at things like the id, ego, and superego. It can look at the different stages of an individual's life. So psychological functions have to do with the individual. We'll look at sociological functions in a moment, and that has to do with the group, the culture as a whole, society. Psychological just has to do with the individual. So in the myth of Persephone and Demeter, we also are introduced to Hecate. We don't see much of her in this particular myth. She's more prominent in others. But Hecate is the old woman, the old wise woman. It's sort of an archetypal figure. And in the myth, then, we have three stages of a woman's life. We have Persephone, the young girl. We have Demeter, who is in the mother phase of womanhood. And then we have Hecate, who is the old wise woman. So as a psychological function, we are introduced to three aspects of a woman's life. Um, and I've provided some other psychological functions here as well. So to keep these videos of a decent length, I'm going to end this one here and then start another video for the remaining